can one have knowledge of oneself?
No, but if you think you have, so if you have knowledge of yourself, it builds up a picture of yourself. For example, if you're getting knowledge of this microphone, then you build up an image, a picture of the microphone, and everything goes into that, and one expects it to continue. Right? As you observe this microphone, you build up knowledge, and that enters into your picture of it and your perception of it. Then you say, I do the same with myself, right? That I know the sort of person I should be or I am. There's a lot of accumulation that builds up in forms that we don't ordinarily call knowledge.
Preferences, like and dislike,
yes.
Prejudice,
Habits.
Habit, all that is in the image that one has created.
Yes. You see, man has developed in such a way that that image seems extraordinarily real.
Yes.
And therefore its qualities don't seem to be knowledge, you see. That one has drawn a map of this whole process. And the question is and when you have a map, you must now be able to look at the country.
Yes.
See what's on the map, right?
When you're looking at the map, you don't see the country.
No, the map may be useful.
Thought tends to move out of its proper area, which is in some way limited, though you can't express its limits precisely. Thought should not try to get into the area which is called spiritual or truth or beauty or love, or the attempt to control the equilibrium of the brain, you see, of the nervous system. Yeah. Thought also thought that it could control the state of the brain. The brain gets disturbed at times in various ways. Thought cannot control the matter of the brain. In other words, thought may be able to control airplanes and spaceships and atomic power plants, but it cannot control the brain matter. You see, it may think it can, but first of all, thought cannot control it directly by trying to use willpower. See, thought may think by willpower it could control the brain, but it can't. See, the other side is the scientific side. Some people, scientists, are studying the structure of the brain. Now, they might imagine that for scientific knowledge we could bring the brain to order, but I think that also is hopeless because you could say fundamentally we've seen the trouble is that the brain seeks self-deception instead of correct thought. Now, if you say some electrical pattern in the brain represents the thought, a pattern that you could measure. But you could say, how could you find in that pattern the difference between truth and falseness?
False, quite, I understand.
You see, there would be no hope scientifically of making that distinction. The thought didn't know that it was a material process.
Quite.
Only recently have we come to know that fairly reliably. And therefore thought could think it was a spiritual thing which contained truth. And for example, if we go into the question of good and evil, thought could think that it could try to be good and avoid evil, you see. Then they would say your problem is to choose good instead of evil. And you can never do it, of course.
I have never realized as a human being the accumulative process is a tremendous danger.
Yes, because that seems to be the essence of security.
And I actually perceive the danger of that. The brain itself produces incorrect thought.
If thought could see its own nature and give a proper account of its own nature, it might think correctly. If that's the proposal, you see. But since it began not seeing its own nature, it began to go off, the correct action, and it got more and more confused and tangled up.
So the brain itself cannot see correct action.
Well, let's say it has not yet been able to see it. At the present time, we have at least one point in our favor that there's a very clear knowledge that thought is a material process. There may be a sort of a functional center which we have, which is temporary, which comes into operation when we have to do something, and then it retires. A functional center which operates from time to time as needed.
And the rest of the time is dormant.
Thought trying to hold the brain in order, also trying to reach the highest principle without mistakenly, began to try to hold the brain in order by organizing a center. Just as it organizes a center to hold the family in order, the tribe in order, so it thought hold the brain in order. It first of all formed the image of a center inside, which might be felt in the solar plexus or the head or somewhere, and also the sense of some broad expanse outside. That is, one gets the impression that there is some sort of a periphery and a center, and the two in some way are related. You see that what happens in one happens in the other. Now, as if it were a being which had an outside and an inside. just as we have our physical being, the body is seen, and we also have our visual perception, which sees the body. And we know that what happens in the visual perception happens to the body. You know, that they are the same, though we describe them as different. So there was a kind of extension of that to form a sort of a mental body and a mental eye, sort of like a mental being.
As all life is a relationship.
Yes.
In our relationship, we create a center.
An artificial center,
An artificial
center, an imaginary center.
Yeah, a center which is imaginary
It's
or
an image,
made of images.
Which we think is necessary.
We think that's necessary to live happily together.
This image center will now call up the action of the functional center to do what the image says should be done. And therefore the image center obtains an apparent reality, an effectiveness, which, as if it were a real being, by taking control of the functional center. It's not, if it were only an image, we would soon discover that it was very, it was really quite weak.
Thought creates the image for convenience.
In the beginning, for convenience of function. And let's say that this image may be useful functionally or technically. Some images have a factual content, and some images do not. Technically, we get to using images quite frequently, which have factual content. And the mind, I think, begins to extend this image-making faculty into other areas where there is no factual content.
Yes.
If I have to go from one place to another, then I form the image of myself being here and the place being there. And that image helps to direct my function and my activity of going. But then this gets extended to the image which tries to control the whole state of mind, or which tries to control human relationships. The image of the self seems to have factual content, but we're saying it has none, you see.
Why has self become important?
I think the beginning was to form this center which would try to take control of the whole process, and an image was basic in forming the center.
The self was formed because of everything being in flux.
You see, the movement involves uncertainty. Why is thought unwilling to stay with uncertainty? Why doesn't it accept the fact of uncertainty? See, that's already a distortion or self-deception.
There begins the deception. If there was no self-deception,
Yes.
would there be any image at all?
Well, that's a question.
Except the pattern of action.
Yes, but there is a kind of image even in the pattern of action, that the pattern, insofar as it's conscious, if you can think about it.
Why should there be image?
If you're an explorer, for example, you have to try to prepare for your exploration, and you don't know exactly what to expect, but people might imagine what is the nature of the country which they're likely to encounter, and they will prepare accordingly. Or else they may have photographs of that country, which would give them some idea of what to expect, right?
One can't live in uncertainty.
First of all, my knowledge is uncertain, right?
Yes.
And I say, secondly, I can't live in uncertainty. But,
That's right.
But now there's some confusion there, you see, because you're also saying you have to live in uncertainty in some way. But why did thought come to this false conclusion, do you see, that it says I can't?
Wouldn't you say in that there's great fear?
But the fear, where did it arise, you see? If you're an explorer, for example, there may be thought which is functional, which is correct and so on.
That's simple.
Yes, but let's say, why does it get caught in the deception? If the thought is functioning correctly, then if there's a fact that there's uncertainty, it just says it's uncertain. You see, it doesn't try to pretend, make an image of certainty. See, the brain somehow moves, creates a disturbance as it operates, and it wants to feel better, and it does not know how, and finally it ends up in self-deception.
Quite.
In order to try to make itself feel better, that's basically what happens, you see. And that, of course, only creates more disturbance, and it gets worse.
Can this self-deception come to an end? Can the brain free itself from all self-delusion?
Yes, and also self-centeredness, selfishness, that's all involved. See, in other words, thought began not knowing its limits, so it was already trying to do things which it has no place to do, right? And trying to provide a kind of security that it cannot provide.
Once you realize psychological accumulation as knowledge is an illusion and destructive and causes infinite pain and misery, when you see it's finished.